call this opera boot camp. Okay. Now, you know, I don't know. It works. And I've done versions of this that have lasted for a day, for 2 days, for 5 hours, depending on the group. Teachers, groups, maybe in other, you know, disciplines outside of the arts, administrative groups. One time I did something like this that was quite long, full day for administrative personnel for Opera America. Can you imagine? But these are all people who are tech people, money people, marketing people, and a lot of them are coming to opera for the first time. You better believe that was fun, because you talk about pedal to the, what is that, pedal to the metal? Is that it? Boy, did I go wild on that one, because these people were, you know, ready for a while. I've done it for kids. I've done it for all kinds of things. So I hope the tone will be hitting where many of you are with this. And I'm going to start with what I'll call the general objections to opera, at least some of them, because people have them. I had them. I came to opera when I was about 19 years old, first time I ever had a clue about it, okay? Except for listening to my mother sing the arias on the radio when the Metropolitan Opera broadcast on Saturday afternoons at Texaco broadcasts live from the matinees. And I grew up with that. And she would sing her heart out in happiness those few hours. And other than that, that's, you know, I didn't like opera. And I've told this story to a lot of you, and you've heard this story. I don't want to spend much time on it. But I had a lot of these same things. I'm only going to give you actually a total of 4 objections. We could come up with 10, or we could come up with 2. But I'll give you some that people use, all right? Let's see. One, people say the stories are stupid. That's maybe not people's first thought, but you have heard people say that. The stories are stupid in opera, all right? Have you ever heard someone say that? Okay, I'm sorry. Wherever you look in our popular culture, and remember, opera was popular entertainment. We've got a lot of super stories going on, and these are just some of them. I mean, they're not all stupid. I mean, they have some good qualities, especially the old Superman. But look, every time we have something that catches the imagination, there's a lot of things in there that, you know, let's face it. And again, Lone Ranger, I grew up with that, you know, wonderful stuff. But if you really analyze it, improbable, couldn't possibly be happening, so many things about it impossible, you know. And you take even the legends that we have, like this is William Tell, one of the, you remember? He defied the authorities and was told that he either would bow his head or he would be forced to shoot the apple off of his son. It's a great Swiss national legend, and there's really no evidence that it quite happened, although there's strands of it that kind of work. But I mean, you know, if you really look at that story, it's probably not what happened, right? But nonetheless, it's the great national legend, the great national story, and there's a phenomenally important opera on it, William Tell, you know, I mean, on and on and on. So the fact that stories don't make sense, or that they're strange or stupid, or that hasn't stopped us, right? No. So let me keep going the right way. So what you have to do in theater always, or with novels sometimes, or with a lot of things, you suspend your disbelief, right? The minute you walk in the theater, you have made a statement to yourself that I'm going to buy into this unless it's totally impossible. And this is true when we see any movie, whether it's an action film or a romance or a historical film. And even a historical film, sometimes we're having to fill in things. So we suspend our disbelief. That's a principle of theater. That you just accept the stories for what they are, because they're just a basis. And you have to realize that in opera, as in a lot of theater, and there's something called the deus ex machina, the God from the machine. Especially in certain periods like the 18th century, 17th century, and even in 20th century works, there's a force that comes in at the end. We have this in mythology. We have this, you know, in stories from ancient times, where just as, you know, about to slay, and then something flies down, you know, from the sky and stops that wrist from the sword going further. Or, you know, just, we accept all kinds of principles. A storm breaks out, the river floods, whatever, where something, and this is the actual theatrical term for it, deus ex machina. And in Baroque operas, there was actually usually a sort of a Cupid figure that would come down from the ceiling. It wasn't that fun. And then do whatever was needed, a little angelic or sometimes not so angelic figure that would stop the action and save the day one way or the other. So again, in theater history is full of deus ex machina. That's one of the conventions where this terrible situation is resolved by something that's completely improbable, which we accept because we've suspended disbelief. And the other thing that you accept in theater often, very often, and certainly in opera, especially at certain periods, is the lieto fine, which means the happy ending. Fine, right? Lieto fine. So there's just a complete mess. And all of a sudden this happens, that happens, and it ends happily. Even tragedies at some points in the history of opera in the 17th, 18th century, early 18th century, 17th century, that we all kind of knew were tragedies, were given happy endings, with the audience knowing enough mythology or enough ancient history to know that down the road, these characters paid for their actions. But the theater required, the convention at that point, that there would be a happy ending theatrically. So Coronation of Poppeo is by Monteverdi is a great example. Coronation of Poppaea, you know? Nero, Poppaea, do you know that story? Anyway, they just do terrible things in the course of that opera, along with the history, the ancient history, right? And it ends happily. And if you know the history, you're going, ah! But actually the convention was that it needed to end happily for a nice evening in the theater. And everybody knew that later those two characters would pay. So these are just conventions. I just named those two, the Deus ex machina and the happy ending, or lieto fine. Now, so yeah, we know it's silly, we know, but we can handle that. Number two, I remember sort of thinking, well, who cares about opera anyway? There's so many more. And for me, musically, I mean, I was interested in orchestral music. I was interested in piano music. I was interested in the organ. I was interested in all kinds of music, you know, not to mention popular manifestations of music and this and that, you know, and Broadway and this and that and that. So who cared about opera, you know? Well, the fact is, opera, since it was invented, and it was invented right around 1600, you can't say when things are invented sometimes, but we know exactly where, when, who, and why. And we can follow the history of opera 400 plus years to the details you can't believe. Anyway, it has mattered. It was considered literarily and culturally and theatrically important almost from its origins, really quickly after its origins. Within decades, it mattered. Within a few more decades, it was sweeping Europe. And it stayed important until the technology of the gramophone in the 19th century, the moving picture with sound. So once film came in and once recordings took over and radio, you know, but it's particularly film, then suddenly it wasn't the show that mattered in town. And the technology really did do opera in many, many ways. And other changes too, but particularly that. So for a good 400 plus years, there wasn't much more important. And even to this day, if you say, who cares about opera, you're really asking the question, who cares about theater? And those of us who, you know, particularly if you're working in a kind of broadly based humanities education for yourselves, for your children, classical education, just good old fashioned education, you know, theater was important. And even if we don't think so, the Greeks thought so, right? And this is not the time tonight to try to rehash all of that. But we know that Western culture is rooted in Greek drama. And many people in this audience tonight are absolutely engaged in the revival, the teaching of the great writers of the ancient times and looking at everything, including the theater. And yes, today it all seems to be a shamble or ruins, you know. But if you have this image of Greek theater, then we need to go back to this image where it really defined the culture, defined the ideas, the playwrights of that long period, you know, laying out the principles that still govern Western culture. So let's just say that those guys cared about theater. And another thing to think about is that if you really look at opera or any theater, straight dramatic theaters, you look across the Western world, and not just the Western world, you'll find that theaters in general and opera theaters in particular, and they're very often a separate theater for opera. Sometimes it's combined, very often it's separate. They're important. They're important architecturally. They're important economically. They're important in terms of the whole dynamic of the city. And they are important in terms of just everything that happens, right? Let me give you that example. And I want to keep making sure that everything, I see a hand that was raised. I don't know that I can get to a hand. If you could hold a question, I'd be so glad. Because at the end, I'll take some, okay? Or even at intermission, all right? Because I've got this thing up and this other thing up and this other control panel up, and I'm not quite sure where to go to pull up a hand. Hope you'll forgive me. This is another, I like to always show this when we talk about, you know, a faraway part of the world. This is the Royal Opera Theater in Oman. And that surprises people. It surprises me when I realized that this had been built. And I mean, look at this. Somebody must think this matters. And I'm spending a lot of time on this, but I really think it's very important that any idea that this is some frill thing and it's long ago and nobody cares anymore, they do. And it is a symbol of a high achievement in our Western culture. And that's the inside. I've never been there. I've been to Oman very briefly, but I've never been in this theater. So we've gotten hopefully rid of that idea. Number 3, what about all those foreign languages? That keeps people away from opera. They say, I'm really interested, but it's in all these languages I don't know, and it's long and it's intense and it's complicated and I won't know what's going on. Beautifully, that's solved now. That used to be a real concern. You had to learn the work pretty well before you ever went or later watched it on video when, you know, VHSs came out, right? But that's gone. It's called supertitles or subtitles. Right now, in virtually any theater of any size, you have the languages. And if you go to some places, whether it's the Met, it's the Vienna Opera, where, you know, you pick your language. I mean, there's little screens, it's above, in many theaters, it's above, but in many, it's right at the seats, and you can pick your language. You can have, the languages are there. They're there on the DVDs. They're there on even on the VHSs, they were there on the streaming. So now we follow. Is it the same thing as knowing the language? No. Are the laugh lines going to be exactly on the note where the composer put the funny word with the funny sets of notes so that you laugh right then? No, not necessarily. But nonetheless, you kind of know. And after you've been through a work once with supertitles, or maybe twice, you really don't need them very much. That doesn't mean you don't look at them, but you know what's going on because the dialogue is not that complicated, okay? And so supertitles solved that problem for the rest of us who don't know 23 languages or even 6, all right? Are we good? Are we good? Have we gotten through those objections? Remember, this is boot camp. Yes, sir, we're good to go. All right. Now, let me back up. At least I hope we are. Let me back up. Or go forward, if you wish. We live, most of us, in a highly sports literate culture. Kids know a great deal about the sports world. And let's pretend like we didn't know about baseball. All right. That would be good. How's that? Can we do that as a kind of a metaphor? Let's say we didn't know much about it and we were confronted with this. Okay. We would sort of kind of maybe be slightly intimidated, or maybe not. But the fact is, if you are, if you were going to be learning about baseball, and somebody starts teaching you about baseball, they probably don't start necessarily with this, unless you just like graphics. They probably start with some history of baseball, maybe some of the earliest stars, some of the old names, way back, Babe Ruth, even before. We would find out about how the rules were made and what they are now, not necessarily in this order. We could do a whole class on this, right? And there are history classes on baseball, very good ones. We would look at things that happened, in the establishment of the teams and many cultural and social issues that changed on the sports field before they changed into society. We would look at the franchises, what they meant to a city, perhaps the stadiums, the coaches, the famous ones, the stars, the financial impact, the social, we could look at all of that in the future of it, right? And if we did all that, we still haven't been to a game, but we would have a lot more understanding of this and why it matters. And when we went to a game, we would be much more ready for it, right? And in fact, you could say until you go to a game, all of this is interesting, but it's still not the same as baseball. At some point, baseball encompasses all these things and more. All right, are we good? So that's sort of what you have to do with anything new. I call it the rugby principle because I know so little about rugby, or anything we start into, right? So what is opera? It is literature set to music. It is story set to music. It is a story with music. It is a story put on a stage of some sort with characters, with costumes, with acting. That's a story that has music. End of story. We all go home now. Oh, you're already home probably, right? That's what it is. And if you take this little phrase in Italian, prima le parole e dopo la musica, and I want everyone to say this, and I know your Italian will be way better than mine, okay? Here we go. Say it. Prima le parole e dopo la musica. Prima, first, le parole. Think of parole. Someone is out on parole, they're out on their word. All right, parole. Okay, first the words, parole, e dopo, and then the music. Say it one more time, or else cross-stitch it on something while we're having this course, okay? Prima le parole e dopo la musica. Generally speaking, music that has text, I mean songs, oratorios, operas, cantatas, first start with the words, and then the music is added. Okay, that's just a principle. Which is another reason why, just put this in your mind, we think about the text of an opera is from the word book, libro in Latin, it's a libretto, a little book. And opera libretti, there were two kinds. One was the expensive kind that the composer might have done up in a beautiful copy, hand copied or printed if they could afford it, or engraved for the commissioner, the prince, the duke, whoever paid for the thing, because someone has to pay for art, right? Generally speaking. But most people would buy a little book about the size of, I don't know, I don't actually have an 18th or 17th century opera libretto, but a little tiny book, a pocket book. Think of it as a paperback book size, thin. And that they were cheap. And you would buy these in advance and you would read them and get to know them. And in the theaters, the lights didn't go down yet. You had candles, even that you would, and they actually have lots of these. They were called terrini. They actually have the dripping wax on these because there were thousands and thousands of these printed for the hit operas every night. People would buy them, or they'd buy them knowing that next week they had tickets, right? So they would learn them and then they'd take them with them and have the candle and they would check everything. It's very, very involved. It's way more involved than we are with our programs. I mean, we read program notes, but we're not clinging to it, right? So anyway, libretto is the little book or the text of the opera, the libretto. Got it? All right. Now, opera, opere. In Italian, the plural is opere, and the singular is opera. But let's look at what it comes from. Opus, Latin, a creative work. We say my magnum opus is the novel I'll never get written, right? Great work. Creative work. An opus is singular in Latin. Opera is plural in Latin. Opera is singular in Italian. Opere is plural in Italian, and it really just means creative works. You can use opere to mean symphonic works, piano works. I mean, I remember when I didn't used to know this. The line of things I didn't used to know is so long. But I remember when I did know this in college, and I remember walking through my first real music library and the big collected editions of the composers and Italian composers who were not particularly opera composers, and it would say opere di, works of some Italian composer, or it was printed in Italy, the edition. And I was going, I didn't know that person wrote operas. Well, of course it wasn't opera, it was works of, right? So work is what it means. So what happened though, is we said this was theater with music. So it was work with music, opera per musica, a dramatic, creative, not necessarily dramatic, creative work. It's drama because we know what's going on stage. That means dramatic, right? Action with music, azione per musica. Drama with two M's in Italian. That's right, with music. Or even favola per musica, fable with music. And sometimes you hear it con musica. So opera per musica, favola per musica, drama per musica, azione per musica. Something on the stage with music. Ultimately, the per musica part drops out and you're left with opera, Opry, if you're thinking about Grand Ole Opry, right? Okay, opera. That's how we get it. So cut the music out part, the words for music, and you've got it. Now, did it just come from nowhere? No. It gets invented in Florence right around the last years of the 1500s, the end of the 16th century. But there are many precedents, all right? I mentioned the Greeks, and we know they had choruses, and we know that things were proclaimed, and we don't know for sure, but we know there was music involved with the theater, and we know that the great speeches and through time, the bard-like quality of history sung, I sing of arms in the man, right? And we know that there was music made, and we know what the musicians said, and we know, we have all that tradition. We have many other things. I'm just going to give you a couple. One is liturgical dramas, which were all over Europe, especially in medieval times. They were very popular Renaissance time at pilgrimage sites, processions at certain holidays, religious holidays, or for saints' days. And then some of these would be turning into little plays. They were sometimes done outdoors. They were done at pilgrimage sites. I've already said that. At any rate, we know that there was a great deal of Christian history, biblical history, Old Testament history sometimes acted out. And those traditions are amazingly interesting and quite old and still done today. Oberammergau, every 10 years, if you know the Passion play that's done in Germany for every 10 years, that thing's produced in the town. The whole town lives by this thing for 10 years. It's really what this town does. Some of you maybe have been lucky enough to go. I've taken a tour of the stage. I've never been able to go on the right year. And it's not, get your tickets now for 20 years from now, right? At any rate, but there's also were a lot of little kind of dramas that were put into other things, like in royal entertainment, intermezzi, or intermedio. So you'd be having some kind of court festivity, and then there'd be this little 10-minute play or 15-minute or 12-minute, and it would be about something in ancient history or the Greek mythology, but it would sort of be complementing whatever's going on in the big overall festival. And these things were elaborate. They had stage sets and they had music and they had costumes and all of the stage effects that anybody knew to do at that point. So this was one very famous one, that an engraving exists for a Medici wedding. So this little thing would be in there, and that's kind of cool, right? It's definitely cool to have that. Okay. Monteverdi is the guy that we're going to go to. So, I mean, I could give you more. I could talk about English masks, which were sort of a parallel to what was going on in the Italian intermedia. We could talk about pastoral dramas that were done at Christmas time. We could fill half a volume with the precedence of music that accompanies a story, some kind of text that has music to present it. But basically what happened is there's going to be a group of Italians. They're going to be well-educated people. They're going to decide to recreate Greek drama. I won't go into all the details. They're called the Florence Camerata, chamber group of people who hung out together, etc. Florentine Camerata. And they really decided to recreate Greek drama, but they didn't get it quite right, because how could they have? We can't get it quite right. We know more about it than they did. But the point was that they took off. They used some of the oldest stories in that were popular in mythology and ancient history. They did this, they did that, lots of little things. And then all of a sudden, this guy who was a very successful madrigalist, big career as a writer of vocal music, just a wonderful composer, Monteverdi, wrote something called Orpheus. You know the story, Orpheus and Eurydice, right? He goes back to get her, right? You know all this. We're not going to go through all these stories. We don't have the kind of time to do that. And look at the frontispiece, if you will, of this edition, which is a little bit not the first one, but look, Favola, Fable in Music, di Claudio Monteverdi, and so l'Orfeo, Fable in Music. We had that term, remember? Favola per musica. Well, Orfeo is a great work. It's still produced. It's produced in all kinds of versions. It's crazy to think that something out of a kind of a little scattered efforts, and all of a sudden this work, which still is fabulous on stage. Monteverdi, he would write some more operas in what was left of his life, and really another one of them is also sometimes produced. So we'd love to just talk more about Monteverdi, but I want to just say a word about it. What gets set up very early on is what we're going to call recitative. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But recitative, just so you have it now, is the singing of texts in a speech-like manner. And sort of, if you were going to say, and this is what it would look like if it were printed. I mean, if we actually looked at this notation, Renaissance notation, or late Renaissance, early Baroque, but still basically the Renaissance style of notation, which is already its own interesting topic. What you see is a melody line with some text under it, right? Dal mio permesso, right? And then you see a single bass line there on the bottom, and yet what would be being filled in is what's very, very interesting. And Monteverdi wrote all the fill in. He even specified the instruments he wanted in his little chamber group. And that was modern, because this kind of thing was, I don't want to say pickup, but there was a lot of possible things you could use to do these things. He was very specific with this work. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to come back to recitative in a minute, but considering how early this is, it's incredibly sophisticated what he put together. But remember, I said he was an extraordinarily successful composer of vocal music, in single line, this new style of what we're calling a recitative style, and also in harmony that we call the madrigals, which we had 6 lines and 5 lines that work together. Not harmony quite like we think of it by any means, but still it sounds to our ears in a what is that, vertical form, although it's actually horizontal lines moving. Anyway, the point is he was a master. More than enough said. Now, what I want to do, I can't do a lot of this for all kinds of reasons, but I want you to hear the toccata. Assuming this will play and you'll be able to hear it. You never know quite how the sound will come through, but there's this wonderful toccata, toccare, to touch. This little opening orchestral number, we'll call it an overture later on, and it's done 3 times, except something like that. But I'd like you to see, and I'll give you the citation for this so you can go find this. This is the complete performance that has been posted by this theater. It's absolutely wonderful to watch. Those of you who have students who have been studying the classics, classical mythology, ancient history, might really enjoy watching a lot of this, jumping around in it if you want. But here we go. So much music from Monteverdi that's so trendy and still speaks to us. I made a big deal out of this. Now, sometimes people produce it and they make it extraordinarily contemporary. They make it out on motorcycles, or there's a lot of crazy productions that are done, but I love the more traditional ones that look like, something out of an urn, if you will. So we'll leave this for right now, and I will move us forward. That's 1607. Think of a couple of decades. Think of it to being like the 1660s, 1670s, 1680s, and then moving on into 1700s, 1720s, 1730s. Actually, I want to get us to the 1730s. I took a big leap. I'm going to back up in a minute and go back to stuff that was happening primarily in the middle. But I have a reason for leaping ahead. And I can fill that in right now, that period that I'm leaping over, by merely saying that what will happen is a continual concentration on serious opera that builds on classical mythology, ancient history, Roman history, the great heroes, whatever. And it will have a very set form, and we're going to come to it in the middle in a moment. And it will be very specific, and it will be very responsible to its form and do exactly what it's supposed to do and be magnificent court entertainment, very impressive. And like anything, if it gets big and serious and grand, at some point, somebody's going to want to prick it and do something quite the opposite. For example, put something light in it, something that doesn't belong in it that could be funny. And this is what will happen. So go back up with me to like 100 plus years in the future from where we were with Monteverdi, 120, 130, and realize that what will begin to happen will be the development of a comic or funny form of opera. And that's the word you see here. In fact, you see both words here. I was talking about serious, that long tradition that I'll come back to in a moment, of antiquity-based, serious, preset works. But then arising from it will come an impulse that we'll call opera buffa, funny opera. And believe it or not, actually, you will have no trouble believing this. It will become quickly even more popular. Because after all, people have been doing the other for 100 years or so. They've had enough of it for a while. It'll stick around. It sticks around, for a long, long, long time. Some people still revive it today. There are modern works by very modern composers that are based largely off of the older form of serious opera or opera seria. So it doesn't die, but comic opera takes wings and flies. And so let's talk about that a moment. Can we do that? I know you guys go back and forth with chronology. You're good with it. I don't want to make too much of a big deal out of chronology. But buffoon, funny, buffa's origin. What will happen is in those serious, let's say those operas had 3 acts. Let's say some of them had 5, but let's say they had 3. You would have room for 2 intermission features that would be funny and lighthearted. Think of it like commercials. Think of it how, sometimes the halftime is more entertaining. You go to a high school or college football game and you get the band, something different than the game, right? So what happened actually, and we know exactly when it happened and where it happened and which works did it and with which serious works, people began making little intermezzi, remember I had that word intermedia a minute ago? Little comic 20-minute vignettes that were in the middle of the serious work. And that worked, and people liked it. And then they go back to serious, and then they would go back to comic, and then they go back to serious. Separate creatures, like a sandwich. And one of the real big, important, earliest, if not the first, is considered to be this one by a guy named Pergolesi. We're not going to spend a lot of time on him. Very important guy, wonderful composer, died so young. Oh my gosh, it's unbelievable. But he wrote something called La Serva Padrona, the servant who became the mistress of the house, and it's got 2 characters, and a third character who doesn't sing, and it is funny. It is so funny and short and clipped and just a few numbers in each of its little parts. Any rate, what will happen is that there will be more and more funny things. And so the rest of the 18th century, see that date, after the 1730s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, into 1800, 10, 20, 30, to this day, comic operas. And they will have preset, time-honored plots. There's only so many funny plots, and characters that will actually be very easy to figure out. They're coming from something called commedia dell'arte. Now, commedia dell'arte is the form or the art of the drama. We think of it the art of the comedy, haha, but really drama, commedia. And this goes back to Italian Renaissance street theater, which actually goes back to Greek theater and the types of characters that were in Greek theater, in Greek dramas, especially the funny or it's really linked. But we think of it more as something developed by the Italians. And these character types that to this day fill our sitcoms, the really good sitcoms are based on these same type of characters. They might have different clothing on. They might, they don't wear exactly the same costumes, but they act the same way, a lot of them. And again, we don't have time in boot camp go through what they are. If we had all day, we would, and we'd look at their characters, and they had lines, and they had you knew exactly what each of the old doctor and the young ingenue and the bold bravuro captain and the silly conniving servants, you knew exactly what they do. Just like in a sitcom, you could turn the volume down on your favorite one, whichever one you maybe used to watch or still do. You already know what they're going to say because it's the same thing they always say because they're in character. Well, in those days, these street theaters and puppet theater, people would learn 1 or 2 roles. These were hereditary roles. And they not only learned the jokes and the lines, but they learned something called the lazzi. And you can get dictionaries and books on lazzi. This is not latte, okay? This is not at Starbucks. Go in and order a lazzi, see what happens. Someone will probably give you something. But a lazzi were these jokes and gags, and they were very old and sophisticated. They had to be practiced. For example, disguises like that. Okay. Sorry, couldn't resist. masks that would help to create the characters as well as the specific costumes, but that's the clothing, which helped. But there were things that you did, like that made it funny. Things that would some of you who saw Cenerentola, the production we saw, there was a red sofa that continuously tipped and popped and fell and wobbled and knocked characters off. And these were gags, right? You know, it could be a ladder, it could be a chair, it could be a pump of a well that always kept falling off in the handle. Think about all the funny. Think about what is it, Beverly Hillbillies? If you ever saw that in the old, or whatever, Gilligan's Island. There's always these things, right? Someone fainting, you know, to get out of a problem. Oh, I'm going to faint, you know, overdone gestures, pantomime, two people going to kiss each other and instead somebody else jumps in and kisses, like puts the dog and you end up kissing the dog. I mean, all these funny things that go on. You'll go through the door, no, after you, no, after you, no, after you. All of these lazzi, which had to be practiced in the olden commedia days, they were absolutely, you would rehearse them and drill them, juggling objects, barbers. The barber was always a great object because he knew everything and he was smart. He had a razor in his hand. So, you know, you had to respect that guy. Singing or whispering to the audience, drinking scenes, eating scenes, storm scenes, all of these go back to commedia, and things that would get exchanged, bracelets, flowers, handkerchiefs, letters, keys being hidden, keys being lost, keys being tucked into something. It's just, you can imagine it, you know, all this. And then something going on, like the famous ones in Barbara of Seville, the music lessons, what's really going on between her and the pianist who's her, you know, and people in disguise pretending to be the accompanist while they're singing messages to the person they're not supposed to be talking to. All of this, lazzi. It's very funny. It's very old if it's done well, and it was practiced and practiced and practiced, and eventually it becomes sort of the you might say the fodder of comic opera. You could almost close your eyes, and once you got the plot line, you knew what was going to come next. But it was never less funny just because you knew it. In good comedy, you know what's going to happen, but it's still funny. Now, are we good with the idea of this? I'm not giving you examples. Cenerentola, which a lot of you saw, is absolutely a very polished version of Buffa. Marriage of Figaro, Così fan tutte, Mozart. There's loads and loads, Elixir of Love, some of you were mentioning. We could just fill, these things were money makers. What the ones we know today are just a tiny amount of the hundreds and thousands that were written, really, and consumed. Like films, you know, most of the films are not famous. They don't, or pop songs, and they were really, everybody wanted a new one. So it was just great. It was moneymaker, made filled very often and usually in a different theater than the dramatic opera. I should mention that. Okay. It wasn't like it would be at the Met now, where one night you might have Cenerentola and the next night you might have Julius Caesar. There were Royal Dramatic Theaters for serious opera and stage drama, and then the places where the comic operas were held. Not everywhere, but very often. You can sort of see that, right? That's you know, sometimes they were together. It's just very interesting. And then there's another type of opera where it really is absolutely outside of the venue of any of this. It's all interesting because you've got how people are responding, right? Anyway, keep going. Let's go back now to this serious opera, this long stretch. This long stretch where you have, let's just say, everybody you've ever known from mythology, ancient Greek, ancient Roman, history, saints, even, all kinds of things are going to show up in this stuff. So let's look at opera seria. It will be this kind of style. And it'll come out of Orfeo and Poppaea and Ariadne and Ulysses and everybody you can name. And those of you studying this material, is a great way to look at other shall we say, other, you know, get that same history through a different taste, through music. That's very fun to do. And then you can see what's right and what's wrong and how these characters are produced. Now, in what we've already talked about, the buffa, but particularly in the seria, a type of singing develops that is quite different from what any of us sing like normally. And it's called coloratura or fioritura, but most often the word coloratura, okay? Coloratura is is that high, very, very fast high singing that when you don't think you like opera and you don't know opera and you hear someone doing it, you go, that's so weird. You go try it. Coloratura has to be taught. It has to be learned. It's fabulous with Italian, with all those open vowels. It absolutely, when you sing Italian and you know how to do the breathing and you can put your voice up there, tenors and sopranos, it's unbelievable. And it marks a style, particularly of seria, but it also marks a style of buffa, all right? And it will stay popular from the early 1600s, the early 17th century, like the 1630s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It gets more and more popular, more and more elaborate. They didn't even write it all down. The singers just knew what to do. You give them a few notes and they would add 1,600 others. I'm exaggerating. They'd add 50 others. And there were formula, and you practice these. It's like jazz. It was improvs. It was patterns, improv patterns. And it will stay important for a long, long time. Now, this brings up castrati, which if you use your imagination, you'll understand that what castrati were choir boys who at a certain age had a certain procedure that would ensure that their voices stay high. Now, if you're not familiar with this phenomenon in opera, I bring it up. It's interesting for one thing. Kids always find it interesting, but it's important because in opera seria, and that's what we're talking about now, that long stretch of historical opera that just was the royal form of opera, was the most important literary form of opera. The heroes very often were roles written for castrati. Why? Well, these were guys whose voices are going to be in the upper stratosphere of soprano register. And the heroic voice in a soprano register was the thing. Now, stop a minute, because this is so different from what we do. But we have a lot of high singing in pop, especially certain styles of pop, not big band, not Cole Porter, not any of that music, not folk music, not Bob Dylan, not, I don't even know who's popular, but if you think about a Michael Jackson kind of sound, and you think about some of the pop music, maybe that people my generation have, and it's still on the radio, there's a lot of really high singing. That's not the best analogy, but it's the best one I've got. Go with me on this. If you accept that a male body with the power of a male set of lungs and the piercing, bright silver tones of a soprano register can be heroic above any other voice, even above the tenor, then you've got the right image. And these guys, these castrati, were famous. If they were good, they made money. And the two most famous were Senesino, who was he did 17 roles in Handel operas. He was the first, they were called the primo uomo. He was the star. And the even more famous, well, not more famous, but competitively famous was Farinelli. And again, we could stop and talk about any of these people. And there is a film, it's very much an adult film, okay, by the title Farinelli. I would recommend it to the grown-ups or you may find a couple of scenes that you would want to play for your kids, very carefully chosen, but they're gorgeous scenes that show what the stage was like, the stage equipment, the Deus Ex Machina coming down, the way they did the thunder and the lightning and the gorgeous clothing that these heroic castrati sang in, and the phenomenal costumes and, feathers out of their eyes as they appeared as these great, it was just extravagant beyond belief. And the sopranos hated these guys. First of all, they made way more money than the sopranos, who were these guys playing opposite the sopranos who they can't produce. The women, even no matter who, could not produce the volume, the power of a castrato. Do you see how that would work? So it's very interesting reading about that time. We're talking about Handel. Hallelujah, chorus guy. Yes, he wrote these operas. Everybody's writing these operas, and Handel would be a great place to start looking for some operas in his title. Whatever you look, you'll find it. But his heroes are castratis. Now, what that means is that when we redo these operas today, what are we going to do? There's not castrati today, thank heavens, right? You have two choices. Well, we have three choices. You could drop it down an octave, everything, and let tenors sing the role. Sometimes it's done. It works. It's fine. It works. You can look for a countertenor, which is a male voice that by nothing unnatural being done or medical or anything, but it actually is a guy who is fabulous, usually a very good tenor voice, but finds out how to put it into this upper register. It's a very specific kind of training, and you have to have a very specific, strong talent. I had a student once at SMU who was a good singer, and by golly, Ned, his teacher really realized what he was a countertenor, and they did some intensive work. And I can't remember the time frame, but it happened pretty quickly. He today goes all over. He's one of the really, really important. John Holliday's his name. If you're curious about it, I can write you or post it or something. I should blog about him. I think I will. I remember him as a sophomore in my music history class. And all of a sudden, I remember the day he came in, his eyes were this big, because for the first time, his teacher pushed his voice up in a way that it's not just about stretching yours. Suddenly, he found this whole register he had that he never knew. And he has this big career now, singing this type of opera with that high, powerful voice. And the third thing you can do is have a woman play the role in what's called, a pants role. You get a woman who can handle this as a soprano, has the power, has the voice, and dresses as the prince or the king or the knight, and that works. So I get all of that in there because, again, we're talking about a lot of different things. Opera is completely accessible, but it is not simple. Is that enough on that? Yes. Now, you remember I said there were going to be 3 types of opera. We had the comic and the serious. The third is dialogue operas, and they develop in a very interesting way too. And a dialogue opera just means that you have a musical work for stage, a story set to music, where the talking is talked and the singing is sung. Talk, 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 sing. And they have names: Singspiel, ballad opera if they're in English, opera comique if they're in French. I could say more about any of these, but we don't have time to. And if you're thinking, characters talking and they sing something, isn't that like our musicals? Yes. Yes, 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 yes. Our Broadway musicals are dialogue operas for reasons that have to do a lot of it with English language per se, which doesn't sing as beautifully as Italian or French, for example, and a lot of other countries' languages, like the Slavic languages. German, initially, were very drawn to this type of opera, where the dialogue would be spoken, and then the songs, the arias, would be sung. We're going to get into all that terminology in the second part of after intermission, which we're going to have here in a minute, as I quickly get through this. Okay, and I think I'll be through this part, and we'll see what we can do. But at any rate, our Broadway musicals are dialogue operas. That's what they are. Are we good? Yay! So the people say, I don't like opera, but I love Broadway. Then you like operas. What you like is dialogue operas. There the 3 are. Okay. Now, I think what we're going to do is take a little intermission. A little 5 minutes. Shall we do that? I hope you're saying yes. I'm going to see what my time says. I'm going to have to pull this chat up. I can pull it up if I do 3 screens. Is everybody happy, more or less? Like the sound of music, you better believe it. You better believe it. Like the sound of music, like Fiddler on the Roof, like Guys and Dolls, like Oklahoma, like Hamilton, which I've not seen live. Okay? Yeah? How's everybody doing? I'm just checking. All right, take a minute. We'll be back at like 2 or 3 after.